Good evening, explorers. I am Explorer Torie, and welcome to the Native Nevada Nature Series. This is a special event from the Nevada Conservation League where I will teach you about one native plant or animal species. This is a nice educational forum for all ages to learn and watch and enjoy. So hope you enjoy it. Today we are going to be talking about the sagebrush, also known by its genus and species, Artemisia tridentata. It's actually known by a lot of names, not just sagebrush. We have the big sagebrush, the Great Basin sagebrush, the Big Basin sagebrush, and then by the locals, it's just normal sagebrush. All of these are Artemisia tridentata. There's a lot of other sagebrushes that are out here, but today we're going to be talking about Artemisia tridentata, which is actually not a real sage. They are a part of the family Asteraceae, which is the sunflower family. Interesting enough. Of course, as Nevadans, you probably already know about sagebrush because Nevada is known as the sagebrush state. That's right, and sagebrush is also the state flower. And you can understand why by looking at this map. You could see that sagebrush is pretty much all over our states. In the south, there's a few little spots, but up north and pretty much everywhere else, you can see sagebrush everywhere. And all over the west too. In over 11 states, you can find sagebrush in these areas. It's classic plant of the west, even up into Canada. So, you may know where to find sagebrush. Let me tell you how to identify it. So, here's a classic image of a sagebrush. It is a big, coarse, many-branched, pale gray shrub. So you can see from this image right here, the branches are kind of like a gray color, and the leaves are kind of like a dull green color. Some say it's gray, and that color comes from, if you look very closely on the leaves, there's little silvery hairs on it, little silver hairs that give it that silvery hue. And the leaves, which are attached at the branch at the axillary nodes, which is right on the stem, they are known to have wedge-shaped leaves. And if you've never seen a wedge before, that's it right there, a little block of cheese. You could see that the leaves are the same shape. So it's wider at one point and then it goes into a narrow point at the tip. So wide and then narrowed. So the leaves are wedge shaped and they are divided into 3 different lobes. So we have 1, 2, and 3. Pretty simple. And then they also are known to have yellow flowers, these bright little balls of yellow flowers. So they can be anywhere from 1 foot to 9 feet tall. So pretty wide range in size, but they're known to be this gray, silvery, green color with these silvery hairs, wedge-shaped leaves with the 3 nodes, and these yellow flowers. You can also probably see a lot of them out here, and if you've probably seen one, you've probably already smelt one. They're very, very fragrant, known for having a really strong aroma. Those are because there's volatile oils in the branches, which also make it very flammable. Sagebrush are perennial, which, let me give you a scientific lesson on plants. Annual plants are those that emerge up, bring out their seeds, and then they die away. And this happens every year. They regrow, distribute their seeds, and then die. So they only stay for 1 year. Well, sagebrush is a perennial, which means they're pretty permanent. Once sagebrush inhabits these deep soils, gets their little roots in and makes it past the seedling stage, they will pretty much stay there, and they can reach ages over 100 years old. It's pretty incredible. So we're about to dive in a little bit of scientific knowledge on Artemisia tridentata. So The sagebrush is actually divided into 6 different subspecies. And really quick, if you don't know what a subspecies is, we have our species, sagebrush, this individual plant, which you saw from the map. They inhabited several places across the United States, 11 different states. And you can imagine, in living in so many different environments, that they have to get used to different types of climate, elevation, precipitation, humidity, all these factors play in. So one sagebrush here in Nevada might develop different traits than living in Wyoming. So they'll have different adaptations for where they live, and these have created subspecies. Basically, differences in the population that you can tell in different areas, but they are technically all still the same species. Now, the differences between each of the subspecies is so hard to tell unless you have them side by side, or if you're a plant biologist who can compare these two, looking at different scientific terms. For us, it may not be recognizable. They all look like sagebrush to me. And even from the scientific community, there's actually a debate. People are debating whether there's 6 subspecies or more or less, or if they're all the same species. So even in the scientific community, there's not a good consensus. So I'm just going to go over the 6 subspecies for you, just so that you know them. So the first one we have is Artemisia tridentata, subspecies tridentata. This is the basin big sagebrush, the classic sagebrush that you'll find here in the Great Basin and all across Nevada. By the way, pardon my Latin, not very good at it. This one is Artemisia tridentata, subspecies Vaccenia. This is the mountain big sagebrush, another big type of sagebrush species or subspecies. Next, we have Artemisia tridentata, subspecies wyomingensis, which is the Wyoming big sagebrush. Still big, but definitely not as big as the big basin big sagebrush. Next, we have Artemisia tridentata, subspecies xericensis, which is the scabland big sagebrush or the xeric sagebrush. They believe this is a hybridization between 2 different subspecies, the mountain big sagebrush and the basin sagebrush. Then we have Artemisia tridentata, subspecies spiciformis, which is the subalpine big sagebrush or the spicate big sagebrush. They also believe this is a hybridization or a combination between 2 different types of sagebrush. And the last one we have is Artemisia tridentata, subspecies parasite. Parish's big sagebrush. This one's very evident because it's restricted to dry, sandy soils up in the hills of Southern California. Very narrow range, so it's easy to find, but you should be able to maybe tell the difference between this one. The rest of them might be a little bit harder to notice. So those are the subspecies that I have been able to list out for you and show you the pictures of them. But they're all part of the same environment, which is the steppe area. So Artemisia tridentata grows in arid or semi-arid conditions, which is all in the Intermountain West in North America. Some people think that sagebrush is a desert plant, but actually it is a steppe plant, which steppe plants usually get a little bit more water than desert plants. There's usually about 7 to 15 inches of annual precipitation, way more than you're going to find in the desert. So they need a little bit more water, but it pretty much looks like a desert environment. Still very arid. But the great thing about sagebrush is if you find one, you'll probably be able to find plenty more. Anytime there's sagebrush or other Artemisia species, they pretty much dominate the entire landscape of the entire area. So for instance, in the Great Basin, there's about 400,000 square miles covering over 11 states and in Canada. It's incredible. So if you find one, you'll be able to find more. But it's still very dry, so they have adapted a bunch of different traits in order to live in these areas. So here's a few examples. You could see really clearly in this picture right here, I have of the ground. You can see the taproot, but it's not a very good example, so I have this illustration on the side which shows the taproot very well. So as you can see, the taproot penetrates pretty deep down into the soil and it gets all that groundwater. So the groundwater is trapped under there and the taproot's able to bring it up and into the surface. The great thing about it is that it actually brings up water to different plant communities as well. So the sagebrush is known as a nursery plant, which means that it can thrive and provide other nutrients to these plants in order for them to survive. So a lot of times plants will go under the sagebrush for cover and they'll be able to utilize the water that the sagebrush brings up. The silvery hairs on the leaves, those help provide protection against heat and wind. And during the hottest summers, they'll get their water from the taproot, and from the winters, they'll be able to trap all that snow cover and be able to harness and retain all that water in its roots. So really cool adaptations. They also help with soil degradation. So a lot of times if oil and gas come in and make the soil kind of unstable, their root system, especially with their big taproot, will be able to provide some stability to the soil. So a lot of these plant communities really depend on sagebrush for water and soil stability. But it's not just plants. We also have sagebrush for indigenous tribes. So remember I told you that sagebrush is very fragrant, and it's because of those volatile oils. A lot of times it's used to discourage browsing by herbivores, even though some will do it, but it's very flammable. So wood was burned for fuel and used in construction for dwellings. The leaves and seeds were also eaten. A lot of Native Americans use big sagebrush for a variety of medicinal and domestic purposes. For instance, the Shoshone and the Paiute used the leaves to relieve toothaches. Different tribes brewed it as a tea to treat stomach ailments. The Navajo used it to wrap joints around the wet sagebrush to help with pain. And they also boiled the tea for treatment of postpartum pain and to help with colds and coughs. Other tribes burned it and allowed the fragrant smell to purify the air. I have this picture of this woman who used sagebrush to build that basket in her hand. So they used baskets, they wove it into ropes, a lot of different uses for the sagebrush. That's why it's very important for these communities for sagebrush. So now that we've looked at the importance on plants and indigenous tribes for the sagebrush, let's look at their conservation status, because it seems like so many different groups depend on the sagebrush. Well, sagebrush is actually threatened. It's under attack. It is decreasing. And you might be asking yourself, Explorer Torie, you told me back a couple of slides ago that the sagebrush was in over 400,000 square miles of, our state. How can that be endangered? Well, yes, the sagebrush used to actually cover over 500,000 square miles across the United States and Canada. This is a better map than what I had last time. You can see a good 14 states that it would reside in. And today, that number has been halved due by a different number of threats that the sagebrush has. So it's really unfortunate, like I said, how important the sagebrush is in all of these communities, and it's definitely decreasing at a steady rate. And I'm going to go over the factors on why it's decreasing, just so that you can understand them. So number one, we have invasive species. So cheatgrass is a very common and typical type of invasive species. So species comes in, they're not from here, they just got introduced into this area, and they end up doing very well in this environment. So they outcompete the different native species and use up all the available nutrients and water so that nothing really else can survive. So cheatgrass, Bromus tectorum, is a great example. Cheatgrass, first off, it's a nasty grass. No one really eats it, so it's not really good for the environment. It's very fast growing, and it takes over areas very quickly. Once it gets established, it's really hard to get rid of. And it also is fire adaptive, which is the next threat to the sagebrush, fire. So fire is really strong. Remember I told you about the sagebrush, those volatile oils that they used to burn for fuel? Well, guess what? They're pretty flammable. So once a fire breaks out, the sagebrush plant itself catches on fire and burns out completely dies. Sometimes if the fire isn't severe enough, they might be able to reseed and grow from it. Well, come in cheatgrass, this invasive species, they take over the area. Not only do they take all the nutrients from the sagebrush, all the area available, they also thrive in fire. So after a fire, cheatgrass will actually emerge first and take over the entire area before anything else can get established. And because cheatgrass is so flammable, it basically adds fuel to the fire. So the more cheatgrass is there, the more fires that happen, the more sagebrush burns, the more cheatgrass comes in, the more fires that happen. You can kind of see the cycle happening over and over again. Basically, fires are happening too frequently, and the sagebrush can't keep up just as well as cheatgrass did. So that's fire. Up next, threat number 3, livestock grazing. So more than 99% of the remaining sagebrush steppe was impacted by livestock. So livestock trample the vegetation, they damage the soil, they clear out entire areas for the grazing, which then cheatgrass, for instance, invasive species come in and take over that area, resulting in more fires. So they do help with the fire cycle, increasing that other threat. Livestock grazing pollutes water, and they deprive wildlife of food and shelter. So these are all poor sustainable methods or unsustainable methods for livestock grazing. So there has to be a change and a way for livestock grazing to be sustainable in order to actually help sagebrush thrive, or else it will just die. Last but not least is development. Any city developments that we have into sagebrush territory. A lot of energy development, wind turbines, solar plants, gas, coal, all of these things encroach on sagebrush land and therefore degrade everything and split it up, fragment it with roads that nothing else can survive in it. So it's very important that we do sustainable development and consider our habitats before building up anything. And it's not only just important for plant communities or indigenous tribes, it's also very important for animal communities. So the sagebrush provides food and habitat for a variety of animal species. The pronghorn, which is the picture in the top top left-hand corner, is only eats sagebrush. And everything like the mule deer, the pygmy rabbit, they all live in the habitat of the sagebrush. They say that nearly 100 bird species depend on sagebrush country for their habitat needs. And several of these animals are obligate or highly dependent on the relationship with sagebrush, meaning that if sagebrush was suddenly to disappear, they would not be able to survive in it. And there's a considerable amount of diversity in these areas. They say from over 220 to 1,000 insect species have been collected in different types of sagebrush plants. Huge amount of biodiversity, all because of the sagebrush that we really need to depend on. And there is one species that is the poster child for protecting the sagebrush. I present to you the greater sage grouse. I'm going to show you this really cool video. There's no sound, but it's only 20 seconds long. Pretty amazing, isn't it? So I'm not going to go too much into detail with the greater sage grouse because I might do a native Nevada nature on it later. But they have these huge air sacs that they kind of slap together to make this really weird sound that I didn't have on because there was no audio. But they, dance around, and this is their mating technique to try to, attract females. So it's really cool, very unique bird, and they're completely dependent on sagebrush in every single stage of its life cycle. So they eat sagebrush. About 70 to 75% of their diet is all sagebrush. They live in sagebrush. The habitat that they stay in is all sagebrush. And their mating technique is in a lek, which is a area of sagebrush, big old giant circles, miles and miles large, where they go around and doing this mating technique. And they return to these mating areas, these leks, every single year. They always return to these same areas to complete their mating and to lay their eggs there. So if all that sagebrush were to suddenly disappear, they would not be able to reproduce. So it's very important for the sage grouse to be able to preserve sagebrush to preserve their numbers. In addition to aiding the sage grouse, studies have shown that sagebrush conservation efforts would help over 350 other species of plants, invertebrates, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals that rely on the habitat. So it's very important to work together to get these sagebrush areas conserved. So you might be asking yourself, Explorer Torie, what can I do? How can I help? Well, there's actually a lot of different agencies working on that exact same problem. Some of them focus on the sage grouse itself, but a lot of them all have the same goal: to protect the sagebrush country, sagebrush habitat, to help all these different species and ecological systems. So I would recommend working with any of these organizations, supporting them no matter how way you can. Make sure to reach out to your congressmen, your congresswomen, your senators. Let them know to protect our public lands and to help save the sagebrush. And now there's other cool projects going on. This one I found out here. It's called Sagebrush in Prisons Project. This is put on by biologists from the Institute of Applied Ecology, and they have partnered with the Department of Corrections here in Nevada, also in Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Utah, Wyoming, California, and Washington to plant and grow sagebrush. So inmates will help put together these plants and help grow sagebrush. And by 2017, nearly 900,000 sagebrush was planted in public lands through this program, Sagebrush in Prisons Project. And they put it in restored burned areas and in areas to support the greater sage grouse. So there's a lot of different things through the Bureau of Land Management going on to help preserve the sagebrush. So make sure to get your support, and if you want to know more, go ahead and just let Explorer Torie know herself. But that's all I have on the sagebrush. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed learning a lot about this. And thank you so much for everybody that did the crossword puzzle. I know it was a little bit difficult, so thank you for trying, and if you completed it, thank you. This is one of our viewers who was able to complete it for us, so thank you for getting that submitted. Next week, we are doing the Gila Monster monstrous word search. So you can see how monstrous this looks. A lot of words. So you're going to be doing a word search to find words that are all related to the Gila monster, which, spoiler alert, is going to be my next Native Nevada nature presentation. So get really excited about the Gila monster by doing the word search, and if you complete it, make sure to share it on our Nevada Conservation page, and it may be previewed in next week's presentation. But until then, just make sure to tune in every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Facebook Live for the Native Nevada Nature presentation, where I will spotlight and highlight one native plant or animal species. So keep your eyes out for that, and good luck on the word search. Until then, keep exploring.